views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Social Justice Forums. I am Daren, Jaime, and of course, we thank you for joining us. If you're asking the question, what exactly is this show all about? Well, we take a look at some of the inequities that many people face. We promote civic engagement, and we have good discussion. Great guests. So stay tuned because the Social Justice Forums begins right now. Welcome back. Recently, President Joe Biden signed into legislation avoiding a partial federal shutdown to keep the government funded through December the 3rd. Now, the political parties dispute over how to raise the government's borrowing cap before the United States risks a potentially catastrophic default. Joining us now is the political strategist and director of the public policy program at Hunter's Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute, Dr. Basil A. Schmeichel Jr. And Dr. Smikle, good to have you back.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks for inviting me as always.
Thank you. And I want to start with this. We've heard this in numerous presidential administrations, the possible looming of a government shutdown. We saw a government shutdown before, but give me your thoughts as to how we got down to the final seconds and what really avoiding a government shutdown really means for America.
Well, there are two issues here. The first, which you spoke about in your lead up to the segment, that the president did sign a bill, and both parties came together to sign legislation to keep the government open. What that means is that it kept the government funded. When you combine it with this question about the debt ceiling, which is related but still somewhat separate, it's the ability of the federal government to pay its debts, to take out loans, if you will. And failing to do so would cause the federal government to default on the debts that it owes for the first time in history. So both of these issues are budgetary in nature; they're fiscal in nature. They are not artificial, but the truth is that they could be fairly easily solved. So this is really a tactic that both parties, but specifically Republicans over the last, I would say, 12 to 15 years has used to force some kind of budgetary or legislative benefit that they would accrue. So it focuses a lot on process. I think when the American people listen to the goings on, it just seems that both parties can't get their act together. But I do think it is a tactic that, in this instance, Republicans are using, hoping that Americans don't really understand the nuances of what's being done.
And when you talk about that, obviously a lot of people are being adversely affected with a government shutdown. Talk to us about who are the direct recipients of a government shutdown. Well,
when the government shuts down, that means federal workers don't get their money. Anybody that gets funding from federal programs won't get their money, and that does impact everything from nursing homes to schools to other types of other nonprofits. And it impacts everything. It impacts significant portions of our lives. So, and most certainly, it will get people lose their jobs or are furloughed. And so, it has a direct impact on our lives. It has a direct impact on our ability to do everything from commute to go to school. And so, you certainly don't want the government to shut down, nor do you want the government to default on its debts, because that means that we can't borrow against ourselves. We can't get support from other governments to the extent that we do. And it sends our credit, if you will, spiraling downward. But again, these are things that I think are used more as tactics and less about the gloom and doom that we think. It's happened before. The government has shut down before, but these are things that are easily solved by good politics and compromise in DC.
Now, there's some people on the other side who say, listen, you know what? The government shuts down. Hey, maybe that's a good thing. The government gets the opportunity to possibly save some money. Can you debunk that myth for us that this is government shutdown also helps us to be able to save some money?
Well, the thing is that just because the government shuts down doesn't mean they're not going to collect taxes. So you will still have to pay for government services. You will still get taxes taken out of your check one way or another. The question is, what is it spent on, and who? And so just because the government isn't spending money, they're not going to stop taking money out your account. So that's one thing. This is really a function of moving resources temporarily, and I do stress temporarily, from one area to another. If they're not paying you, they may end up paying you retrospectively, which would happen, because it's not like you're not if you're a federal worker, it's not like you're entitled to that money. It's not like you're not entitled to that money. Let me say. I mean, you have a job, you're supposed to get paid, but the government doesn't have the money to pay you. So like anything else, they could either let you go or furlough you, or you could just be a recipient of any pay retroactively. So we haven't gone down that road at this point. There are times in our history where the government has furloughed its workers, but they do bring them back. And it's tough on those workers, it's tough on those families. It becomes problematic for our economy, because that means people are not spending money. But don't think for a second that the government's not going to take money out your check when the time comes.
Oh yeah, the money's coming out one way or the other. And as I told some people else the other day, I said, if the government shuts down, don't you worry, because there is a thing called retroactive pay, and somehow or another, people do get their money one way or the other. Let me shift focus for a minute and talk a little bit about the debt ceiling. We continue to talk about the United States being the richest country, but then we also see ourselves as a highly indebted nation. Give us an update as to where we are about the debt ceiling and your thoughts.
Well, we are at a crucial point because next week the government will hit its deadline, if you will, to extend the debt ceiling, meaning that there's generally this cap in terms of the amount of debt that we can take on as a government, and we should not surpass that, but we always surpass it. The federal government, unlike the state and local government, is the only entity that the government entity does not have to balance its budget. That's true because you don't want the federal government having to balance a budget when we're at war, for example. They need to be able to spend as much money as they can to defend the nation, to support programs to get itself out of a depression or a recession, for example. So federal government doesn't have to balance its budget. Having said that, it does have to maintain certain standards in terms of the debts that it takes on and its ability to repay those debts. So it's not just a debt necessarily to other countries, although that is significant. It's also a debt to its bondholders, which could be American, it could be abroad. Anybody that the country is indebted to wants their money. And so if the federal government were to default on that, it hurts our credit rating. It hurts the faith that other countries have in securing bonds from us, in anything that we would promise in terms of support for loans or for any projects. And if you're selling bonds, for example, like the federal government does, whether it's to Americans or to folks abroad, it definitely would hurt the faith that any bondholder would have in our ability to pay. Again, this is not artificial because it's real, but it can be solved when the two parties come together, as opposed to using this ceiling as leverage to force some kind of other legislative policy.
What's the best way? You know, from your perspective, how do we get out of this? Because uh, anyone who knows that we've been in this for far too long. The numbers continue to rise. Uh, from your perspective, looking at the numbers, what would you see as a possible way of really us being able to reduce the debt ceiling?
Well, the issue is that we could get out of it, or at least solve this problem in the short term through a reconciliation, which can take place between the House and the Senate. Both Senator Schumer and Speaker Nancy Pelosi have said that this is not a good idea because it's not only a very cumbersome process, but it will take time, and we can solve this as they said, as I've said, that this can be solved very easily, very quickly, if both sides, but particularly the Republicans, actually come to the table and stop using it as a threat. The other issue is whether or not there is a sentiment among the American people that the government is taking on too much debt. The truth is, we can pay our debts as a nation. That really is not the issue that drives a lot of the decision making. It's pure politics, really. It's the decision and the preferences of the people in power that drive how money gets spent, how much it gets spent, and where it gets spent. So while the from an accounting standpoint, you certainly don't want to incur a lot of debt. From the average person, that makes a lot of sense. You don't want to pay. You don't want to have more liabilities than you do revenue coming in to be able to pay those bills. But the federal government can make that work. They can make that work by adjusting taxes. They make that work by cutting programs in many different ways. But it doesn't stop them from spending money on the things they want to spend money on. And that's really, from our point of view, where the rubber meets the road. Does this create a situation where the government, federal government, is not going to support the things that we care about? But I think that comes down more to politics than just balancing a checkbook.
Politics is the word of the day, and that's what we're talking with Dr. Basil Schmeichel Jr., who's here with us, sharing a little bit about his perspective when it comes to the whole thing, when it comes to debt ceiling, dealing also with the government shutdown. And now let's talk about that infrastructure plan. We know that President Biden has an infrastructure plan. Many have been waiting for a long time. This was supposed to come under the Trump administration, but we actually see more traction now with the infrastructure plan. What can you tell our viewers with regards to the infrastructure deal?
Well, the infrastructure deal is something that is still being worked out, not just between Democrats and Republicans, but also within factions within the Democratic Party. You have progressives and moderates who are both trying to figure out, what the good sort of number is. There are many and progressives that want this 3.5 trillion. Some moderates, particularly Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia and Kristen Sinema from Arizona, who've been focused on a much lower number because they felt that it would not be palatable to their constituents. But I do feel strongly that an infrastructure bill will get done. In this bill, you have support for everything from trains, buses, mass transportation, the ability to get more money to fix bridges and tunnels and roads. But it also, and I think this is what the progressives have been focusing on quite substantially, is that it really considers how work has changed. So when we think about, historically, bridges and tunnels and the importance of mass transit because we all need to get to work. What happened in the pandemic? We all stayed home and our work changed. We need to also think about childcare workers as a form of work that is changing, evolving, and growing in many instances. For some of my friends, for example, do you consider DJs as a business? And what does that mean? And what kind of support for people that do that kind of work. So the point being that the pandemic has showed us that work has changed, how people work has changed, and therefore broadband infrastructure could include things like support for bridges and tunnels, but it should also include broadband for people to be able to work from home, for students to be able to take classes from home. So the larger number, that $3.5 trillion number, is meant to encompass all of the ways that people have traditionally worked and how they may work in the future, what that means for how we live and how we commute, and how that may change. The smaller number, which again, Republicans and some conservative moderates are looking at, is falls along the more traditional lines, a more traditional conversation around infrastructure. But I do think there'll be a compromise, and there will be a bill by the end of the year.
Yeah, we talk about seeing a bill and we talk about seeing compromise, but the fact is that Democrats do control the government in terms of the Congress, but then in the Senate, we know Republicans still control the House. But you have a Democratic president, you have a Democratic Congress, and you've got some on the other side who are saying, listen, well, not even on the other side, who are Democrats who are saying, can we push the green light a little bit more on some things, given the fact that we have a Democratic president and the Democratic Congress? Give us your take on where we are there in terms of really moving things along, because if we're really looking at it, we're only one more year away from the midterm elections and things could possibly change.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, the midterm elections are a very important marker in any administration. And it is right for us, and certainly for Joe Biden, to be focused on whatever changes and policies he can promote before that. We do, we have a Democratic president, Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate. And in that time, presidents who have both houses of Congress should be able to push legislation through. We saw that with the New Deal under FDR. We saw under LBJ, Great Society programs pushed when he had both houses of Congress. And we saw as recently as 2009 with the Affordable Care Act that Obama was able to push that through when he had both houses. But it got challenged during after the midterms when we lost seats. Going back to Bill Clinton, a very controversial piece of legislation called the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which a lot of folks did not like, was pushed through during a time when he had both the House and the Senate. And so this is a moment for Joe Biden to be able to promote and get past a signature piece of legislation. I think voters are looking at this and saying, why aren't you using your power? Why aren't you using your bully pulpit? Why can't you get this thing pushed through? Even with the infighting within the party, the problem is that we have Joe Manchin and Sinema, who I mentioned earlier, two senators from one a purple state and in Arizona and West Virginia, which is a bright red state. Manchin just happens to be a Democratic senator within that state. He is really the linchpin here because this is someone that Biden has worked with in the past, someone that Biden respects. But the concern is that if you lose him, if you lose his vote, and potentially lose his seat when he's up for re-election, then the Democrats lose the Senate, and therefore we lose our ability to push legislation through. And so it's a difficult dance that not only is focused on the here and now negotiation around this bill, but it also focuses on the Democrats' ability to get anything else passed if we lose seats in the House or the Senate.
Before we go, just want to have the opportunity to tell our viewers what you're up to. So let our viewers know what you're up to and where they can reach you.
So I am now the director of the public policy program at the Roosevelt House Institute for Public Policy at Hunter College. So, I'm focused on training the next generation of advocates and thinkers and policy analysts, and pretty excited about that. We have a number of students that I'm preparing right now to do their presentations in their public policy research on a range of issues. So we're pretty excited about that. Always available on TV and radio or on social media to engage on a number of different issues. So you can find me at Hunter College. You can find me in some versions of my name on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and Twitter.
Well, good to have you. And I want to thank you again for taking the time for being with us here on the Social Justice Forums, bringing us up to speed and giving us some clarity and some perspective. Dr. Basil Schmeichel Jr., thank you so much for being with us, and glad to have you back.
Thank you.
All righty. Well, we're taking a quick break here on the Social Justice Forums. We do have more show. Don't go anywhere. It's Hispanic Heritage Month, and we are going to honor and talk about Hispanic heritage. We'll talk about that in a few. And welcome back to the show. Founded in 1990, the Hispanic Federation seeks to empower and advance the Hispanic community, support Hispanic families, and strengthen Latino institutions through work in the areas of education, health, immigration, civic engagement, economic empowerment, and the environment. The organization works locally and statewide, as well as nationally, to strengthen Latino not-for-profits, promote public policy and advocacy, and then also bring a scale of portfolio of initiative community programmings. Well, joining us now to share more and discuss is the Vice President for Policy and Strategic Engagement at Hispanic Federation, Ingrid Álvarez. And Ingrid, good to have you.
Good, thank you for having me, Daren.
I am glad. And so listen, for those people who may not be so familiar with the Hispanic Federation, why don't we just first give a little overview as to who the Hispanic Federation actually is?
Great. So the Hispanic Federation, we're a national organization. Our area of expertise is we're institutional builders, and what that means is that we work and bolster and strengthen our Latino nonprofit sector across the US, specifically in all of the states that we live and we operate in, and that includes New York.
Yeah, and so you're all around and you're taking care of business for really the Hispanic population. Talk to me a little bit about some of the issues that we're dealing with, because I know that presently right now, as we talk in the United States, immigration is a huge issue nationally, but it's also a great issue locally.
It is, and so there's no question, right, that in this unprecedented pandemic that we're still living through, that COVID-19 has exacerbated our immigration work and the need. And there's also no secret, right, that for decades, our immigration system is just broken. It doesn't serve our citizens. It doesn't serve the millions of hardworking individuals and families that live in our country and contribute every day that are undocumented. And just most recently, we suffered a blow. The Senate parliamentarian had an opportunity to step up and create the opportunity for a pathway to citizenship that would alleviate the stressor of our broken immigration system on millions of people in our country. With that said, at the core of who we are at the Hispanic Federation, we're advocates. And so we continue to double down and stand strong in our advocacy to ensure that a comprehensive pathway to citizenship happens. In the interim, we've launched an unprecedented $1 million immigration legal defense fund nationally. And that fund aims to assist and aid and provide both the human capital, the legal representation, and the financial resources to countless of individuals and children on our borders, to address the backlog in our immigration courts to get their cases heard, and to create some form of relief in that system.
Yeah, Ingrid, tell me a little bit about this, because I've talked with our, political analyst, not our political analysts, and also our legal analysts as well. One of the things we talked about from the legal perspective is just this: when you talk about the court system and immigration cases, prior to COVID, it was already a backlog as it is. With COVID now coming into play, you have a lot of people who are hanging in the balance, a lot more people who want to really get in, and they, in essence, can't, simply because of COVID-19. So can you give me a little bit about how COVID-19 has really impacted the whole immigration work?
Well, I mean, the backlog, and that's an understatement at this juncture, right? And so part of the concern, right, is that the law says, right, we have laws that immigration laws that should be honored. And while social distancing and COVID has created situations where, I mean, I don't know if you've seen, and sometimes on the media, there are images where you have, 5-year-old children without legal representation in front of an immigration court judge. That's just, it's just broken. And so what we're trying to do is that we've partnered with over 70 Bureau of Immigration Appeal accredited nonprofit organizations all across the country, including here in New York. And what accreditation affords a nonprofit entity that provides legal services to a community is free or low cost immigration services. It also allows for attorneys and pro bono and to actually pay for the legal representation. So whatever or wherever we can alleviate some of this backlog, so that if a person is here and is seeking asylum, if there is a legal opportunity for a child through juvenile status to be able to adjust and continue on the continuum of our immigration court system, that happens. We can't hold people indefinitely. Most recently, we saw the atrocious images of Haitian refugees on the border in Texas. We have vehicles and pathways that if we wanted to create systems change, we could, to alleviate. It is not good economically, it's not good for us in our nation. And as I mentioned, just as of the decision in September through the Senate parliamentarian, hugely disappointing. We could have created an opportunity for at least 8 million people who served and continue to serve as essential workers, the opportunity to at least have their case heard.
Yeah. Let me do this and bring this issue to the forefront about COVID-19, because COVID-19 has had wide-ranging impacts for a lot of people, and particularly those in communities of color. When we look at immigration, we know that was a hot button issue, and how that's actually affected so many right here in our area. But talk to me a little bit about what you found to be some of the biggest challenges that COVID-19 has done in terms of impacting your work as well as your constituents.
So prior to COVID-19, right, Black and Brown communities historically have fared worse when it comes to health outcomes, when it comes to all of the social determinants of economic security. And what COVID-19 essentially has done, not only has exacerbated that, but unmasked this reality, right? That for some, you know, we just have not had enough traction in being able to turn around or create deeper impact around alleviating the root causes of inequities. And so, for example, in New York, right now, only about 53–54% of Latinos within communities of color have actually received a vaccine, a shot in their arm. And so one of the ways that the Federation is responding to the need is our communities are hungry. They're hungry for information. They're hungry for access. And when people talk about vaccine hesitancy and why in communities of color, well, we need to meet folks where they are, right? Where they live, where they work. You know, our communities, our people need trusted faces and voices, our trusted faces and voices to share our own experiences with vaccination, with COVID-19. And one of the ways that we continue to work at that is that in partnership with the New York State Public Health Department, our network of Black and Brown community-based organizations, we have food distribution centers where we roll up with mobile vaccine units. At the very least, we're able in a culturally and linguistic manner connect with our people, talk about the importance of vaccination. You know, we continue to be the communities that die at the highest rates of COVID still today. Latinos in particular are impacted by COVID 4 times, you know, we have 4 times higher rate than our white counterparts. It impacts our ability to learn, it impacts our ability to work, it impacts our ability to take care of our children and our families and our communities. And so we launched, it's a campaign called La Vacuna para Todos, that translates to the vaccine for all. And it's really a targeted approach in the way and manner that our people receive information in the trusted spaces. So whether it's the barbershop, whether it's the supermarket, whether it's at the food pantry, whether it's church, and co-locating it with the vaccine mobile unit and bilingual, bicultural folks that ultimately can lead to a person making the decision and saying, you know what, I'm gonna get vaccinated today, and facilitating it that way.
Are we hearing still a lot of hesitancy given the fact that we're now in the place where we're giving booster shots? Talk to me about hesitancy. Do you find that to be of great issue in the Latino Hispanic community?
So I'll preface it with, when I talk about hesitancy, yes, historically in this country, Black and Brown communities have had really negative outcomes that have led to serious trust issues with healthcare institutions and systems. But separate and apart from that and beyond that, where we are today with COVID-19, as I mentioned earlier, our people want information. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's not enough information filtering through in the places where people are. People got to work. People have to go to school, right? And if you meet them where they are and do that culturally and linguistically competent, then you're able to then arm them with the information. One of the things that also creates a person moving from, I'm not sure about being vaccinated because I don't have all the information to, I'll get vaccinated, is facilitating the vaccines in their neighborhoods. Right. These mobile units are critical, right? And the investment in those mobile units and making it, just because we make something accessible doesn't mean that it's available to us all. And so that's a huge part of hesitancy, and not to be misconstrued, whether our people don't necessarily or necessarily choosing not to vaccinate. It's just there are hurdles, right? And it's not necessarily available even when we're reading and we're seeing that something is made accessible. That's no different than, you know, back to the immigration issue, Daren, on how when federal support and federal response to COVID-19, both for workers and the business sector, were rolled out, that, you know, it locked out millions of folks And so specifically, one example right here in New York is the newly launched Excluded Worker Fund. And so after much advocacy with partners and members and working with our Senate Majority Leader Schumer, New York State, possibly one of the first in the country, to establish and create an Excluded Workers Fund to support and provide relief benefits to essential undocumented workers in New York State. And at the Federation, we're a proud partner of that initiative. And talking about backlogs, you know, there was a 17-week backlog in the system. And so in order for someone who is an essential undocumented worker in New York State to be eligible for this fund, they need an ITIN number to apply. And so how do you apply when there's a 17 backlog? And so back to systemic change and creating processes that work for people to access support and benefits. We were able to, working with the IRS, remove that 17-week backlog so anyone who's eligible can log on to the Department of Labor website or report to one of the 70 community partners working across New York to support undocumented workers to apply for these benefits, to do so.
Talk to me about undocumented workers for a minute, because we hear a lot about the word undocumented. And when you hear undocumented, there's a lot of myths and stereotypes that are associated with undocumented that I know that your organization really works to debunk. But can you give us a little bit about some of the myths and stereotypes that are associated with the undocumented and how you work to debunk that?
All right, so I'll define an ITIN. Sometimes we use jargon in the work, right? And so that's an individual tax ID number. And if you are in this country and you are here without some form of legal status as our laws exist now, that doesn't prevent you from working. And if you do work, and many, if not all, of our documented brothers and sisters in this country work every single day, contribute to our local economies, and pay taxes. And so through that tax ID number, they pay their taxes. It's not a social security number, but for those of us in this country who are fortunate enough to have been born here, to naturalize, and we have our social security number, you know, undocumented workers, when they file their taxes, they use their ITIN number. Our undocumented community is an integral and critical part of our economic recovery, our economic stability, and any future economic growth. You know, and with that being said, when you have hundreds and thousands of them in New York State having been locked out during a national health crisis, right? These are the same people who cleaned our hospitals, who took care of our kids, so many of us can go to work, who grow our food, who delivered our food, who cooked our food all throughout, and still today, as we navigate and continue to adjust and live and work in this new normal with COVID-19. And so, yeah, debunking myths is a critical component of our advocacy work, because everything I've just shared with you, Daren, fact, right? They pay taxes, they work, they contribute, they support local, state, and our national economy, and any building back a better plan nationally that we have as a country that is critical for us in moving forward from this pandemic is also centered around our undocumented brothers and sisters.
Yeah, and so the work continues. And so you got boots on the ground, you're really in the area of advocacy and policy. What can you tell our viewers about some of the things and the initiatives that you're presently working on?
Yeah. So one, thank you for helping us pass the word. So La Vacuna para Todos is our New York vaccine campaign, and that's both outreach, education, and shots in arms, changing minds and hearts and meeting our folks where they are to ensure. We have a toll-free hotline, and that's 1-866-HF-AYUDA. That hotline is also manned 24 hours round the clock in English and in Spanish, and anyone who may need assistance and things that they're eligible for the Excluded Workers Fund can reach us via that number. And then La Caminos de Esperanza. La Caminos de Esperanza is our legal defense fund. And that is also a critical component of our COVID-19 response. And so when you put needle and thread to all of our direct community initiatives, and you couple that with our advocacy work, our education campaigns, it starts to comprehensively support our communities in both their journey to receiving, understanding, myth busting, and then making available, making accessible services and benefits that they are entitled to available. Another thing that we have just launched is the Hispanic Federation Redistricting Academy. After every census, census numbers change, and with population changes comes the possibility that in any particular state you live in, that your House, Senate, and representative seats and district maps are redrawn. And so are your US congressional district maps redrawn. Sometimes our systems and our policies are very dense, very legal, and very complicated. And so the Hispanic Federation Redistricting Academy, it is our response to both our people in our communities where the rubber meets the road, and our leaders, whether they be community-based organizations, leaders like you, Daren, through this program, leaders in our faith-based communities, in all of our community spaces, to start to deconstruct those systems and processes so that we understand them, so that then we are also arming our people with either the positive or negative impact that redistricting or gerrymandering has on our communities, and then walking them through and arming them with the tools and the advocacy capacity to then go back to their districts, right, with their own redrawn maps and say, no, right? And so that's another critical aspect of our work right now, and that's happening in every single community that we live and work in. And it has serious consequences when our people's voices are not at the table, when they're not part of the decision-making process. And oftentimes what we need to do is be that bridge, right? From this is what it is, this is how you do it, right? And supporting them through that journey so that they're advocating for the resources and the representation that they deserve.
Yeah. Ingrid, we got to leave it there. I want to thank you so much for being with us here on the Social Justice Forum. Ingrid Álvarez from the Hispanic Federation, thank you so much for being with us and sharing with us. Listen, I cannot wrap this up without asking this one last question. You got me a quick answer. Behind you, I see the boom box. You want to just give us a little bit of history right there?
I am a proud native Bronx Latina, and hip hop is enmeshed and embedded in every fiber of what makes me who I am. And so let me just, since I've been working from home since COVID a lot, and in beautifying my workspace and making it conducive, got the boombox in the back. It brings me joy. It reminds me of who I am and where I'm from. So yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for being with us and definitely represent. Got to have you back, Ingrid Álvarez. Thank you so much for being with us here on the Social Justice Forum.
Thank you for having me.
All righty, a quick break, everybody. Then we'll return with more show. We'll be back in a few.
If you're struggling to afford your internet bills during the pandemic, there's a temporary government program that may be able to help. It's called the Emergency Broadband Benefit, and it provides up to $50 monthly discount on your broadband bill to qualifying households. Find more information about the program, including if you qualify and how to enroll, at fcc.gov/broadbandbenefit, or call toll-free at 833-511-0311. That's 833-511-0311.
And welcome back to the show. Communities United for Police Reform is an unprecedented campaign to end discriminating policing practices in New York. Now, the campaign brings together a movement of community leaders, as well as lawyers, researchers, and activists who are actually working for change. The partners in this campaign come from all 5 boroughs of the city, from all walks of life, and represent most of those unfairly targeted by the NYPD. Fierce is an organization that is building the leadership and power of the LGBTQ youth of color in New York City. And they're also dedicated to cultivating the next generation of social justice movement leaders who are dedicated to ending all forms of oppression. And joining us now to share a little bit more is the executive director of Fierce, Mustafa Sullivan. And Mustafa, good to have you back here.
Nice to be back. Thank you.
Yeah, and so talking about this really talking about the NYPD, we continue to hear stories of people challenging the NYPD, aggressive policing, broken windows policing. From your perspective, where we are right now, how would you rate how the relationship is between NYPD and community?
Well, I think there's a couple important things to be clear about. One is the violence continues. Right, they just killed someone in the Bronx, Mike Rosado, just a few weeks ago. And we know that the pattern of violent behavior that goes unpunished, that the mayor and the police commissioner continue to allow killer cops to be unpaid on the payroll. We know that, in spite of, a federal monitor ruling in 2013 that NYPD stop and frisk policy was racist. We know that, and continues to be racist. We know that policy continues, even though the police department claims that it's not continuing. And we know that they never defunded the police. Last year, there was a promise by the mayor and some elected officials to defund the police and take $1 billion out of the police budget. We know it was a bunch of smoke and mirrors, and that never happened. And they're continuing to underfund our communities and overfund police, underfund housing and all the different issues, and continue to fund the police.
So where do you go from here? Obviously, you're training, as I said, the intro, a new group of leaders to really stand up and to be vigilant, and not just to be vigilant, but to be really voices of advocacy when it comes to these issues. Talk to us about the message that you want them to carry out.
Well, I think the first thing is really thinking about what are the root causes of violence in our communities and in our neighborhoods, and where do we see things like schools, things like mental health support, things like our hospitals, things like the COVID care that we're supposed to be receiving. All of these things we know are underfunded and not supporting our communities, supporting Black and Brown communities. And then we see bloated police budgets. So I would say really people should continue to look at the money. People in our communities also should know their rights, know that you have the right to document police violence if it's happening in your neighborhood, and that you have the right to be protected from unjust search and seizure by the police, and that they're supposed to be, according to the Right to Know Act, they're supposed to be giving out business cards and claim if anytime they stop you, they're supposed to notify you who they actually are. And we know throughout the city that continues to be a problem, that police are not identifying themselves and violating the rights of our community. But we know our rights, and we continue as an organization to educate our community about our rights and about the real need in our communities to document police violence and police interactions all over the city.
What's the process, if you will, for helping young people to really know their rights? Because so many times we see, and we can watch social media, of course, and you can see incidents where adults actually step in and say, no, that's not right in terms of how you're handling a minor. But what's being done on the ground level to really help educate minors and those youth as to what their rights are, particularly when it comes to a police interaction? Because let's be honest, many times when a youth has an interaction with a police officer, it's pretty much from a subservient way, and they're not asserting their rights, but they do have rights.
It's about training. It's about getting the information out there. On our website, changethenypd.org, groups or individuals can download Know Your Rights packets. And also on there, you can look up the different community organizations. We're made up of 200 community organizations. My organization, for example, Fierce, is located in Fordham in the Bronx, and we do Know Your Rights trainings. And we are continually doing outreach in the community. So letting people know where we are, letting people know that we can do Know Your Rights trainings in the blog, in the community, in our office, virtually, because it's all about information. A lot of people don't have the right information about how to deal with police interactions. And, we see it as one of our primary goals, and has always been since we've been in existence since 2012, to continually fight and get out the message to people about their rights and knowing how to protect themselves and how to protect each other.
What's the relationship been like with you and your organization when it comes to conversations with law enforcement and the police in particular? We know that there are police community relations in each precinct, but talk to us about what that relationship has been like for you, having these conversations and really being able to address these issues.
Well, I think the main thing is, we're a community organization that works with people all over the city, and collecting information, stories, real direct experience, including, many families that we work with who have lost family members, lost people in their families due to police violence. And so part of what we continue to message is that those cops who killed people in these families need to be held accountable, and the families that have lost people need to be compensated, need to be honored, and need to be dignified by the city and by our mayor. And we know that the mayor has not been doing that, right? We put in really clear changes that 16 families and over 70 organizations want to the NYPD discipline matrix, and we haven't seen those changes being made to the discipline of police officers. And we know that the mayor, even though they're on their way out, they still have time to change that matrix to honor the families and fire the killer police officers that we know are still collecting checks. And we're talking about families who've been waiting years and years. We're talking about Antonia Williams' family, who's been waiting 2 years. We're talking about the family of Kawasaki Trawick, whose family has not gotten justice. And now we see Mike Rosado in the Bronx. So that's really what we need from the police department, and that's not what we're getting, nor are we getting that from the mayor's office. And we're not seeing a lot of pressure or enough pressure being put by the city council on the police department for these incidences.
Yeah, we talked about what's not working. From your perspective, what is working?
I think the dialogues in communities. A lot of people are really thinking creatively. What does it look like if we're gonna deal with the mental health crisis in our neighborhoods, for example? A lot of people are talking about, well, what should we be doing in our communities to support mental health, to support wellness, to help deal with crisis intervention, right? We know that, this pandemic has been hard for people economically. So I'm proud to say we're one of the groups, along with many groups across the city, that are providing direct mutual aid and providing food to people and making sure that people are supported. And so we believe that in violent interactions, in crisis intervention or crisis interactions in homes, that our communities can protect ourselves. And we just need to be more creative and challenge our elected officials and challenge the city to give us resources to support these alternatives to police.
Is there anything working that you see in the area of police that really between community and police, or the police are doing that are really that you can really cite as a positive?
Well, the only thing I can say is that the dialogues are continuing, and that there is, at the very least, people who are opening up this conversation about what the police budgets are looking like. And I'm not saying that's coming from police, but I think it's coming from community groups who continue to put pressure, and more people are asking the right questions, and more people are having the right dialogues about what safety looks like without police.
Yeah.
So,
are you optimistic? Are you optimistic, given the fact that there is a possibility, and it's a high probability, that Eric Adams may be the next mayor of the city of New York, and given the fact that he does have a police background, working as a police officer, are you optimistic that there will be at least an open ear and possibly the potential for change?
My optimism is that de Blasio will be out. That's really as far as it goes for me. I think, I've been a part of some organizations that have started to have conversations with the potential incoming mayor. I don't know what that means. Conversation is conversation, and then when someone gets in office, it can be, as we know, a whole other deal. And so I like to wait and see until the change actually happens, and that we're actually in the process of these negotiations to even know, or these conversations to even know what change looks like. I've been an organizer for 20 years, so it's really hard for me to be optimistic politically, because I've seen the rug get pulled out of communities for so often.
Yeah. Well, before we go, give you an opportunity to share a little bit, or I'll give you an opportunity to share a little bit about how people can get connected to the organization and the work that you're doing.
I would say, again, check changenypd.org and pay attention over the next few weeks. Our collective organizations are going to be doing some research. They're going to be talking to neighborhoods and talking to communities about police violence, about defund the police, and about alternatives. And we want to hear people's voice. We want to engage people in this conversation. We'll be in the Bronx and in the 5 boroughs during the month of October and November, talking to people about what are the solutions, what are the key community solutions to police that we want to see, what are the interactions people have had, and what do people really think about defund the police, and what it is that we need in our neighborhoods as priorities. And so I would say pay attention and look out for us to be in your neighborhood, like I said, October and November, to have these conversations.
Well, Mustafa, great having you here with us on the show. Certainly continue to let us know how things are working out. We'll look forward to seeing you possibly in the new year with some new initiatives, and talk to us about how things are going with the new administration. Mustafa, great to have you.
Thank you so much. Have a great day. I appreciate it.
All right. Mustafa Sullivan, our guest here on the Social Justice Forum. I want to let you know we come to the end of our show today. Hopefully you enjoyed this week's discussion, as we talked a lot about the issues. Now, you can rewatch the edition on BronxNet TV or BronxNet.org. And if you want to join in on the conversation next week, of course, you can do that as we elevate the discussion and bring you more right here on the Social Justice Forum. I am Daren Jaime saying take care, God bless, and we'll see you soon.